September 1954 was unusually warm in Boston, the kind of lingering summer heat that made sweat collect under hard hats and trickle down the backs of the demolition crew. Jake Moretti wiped his brow as he surveyed the abandoned Blackwood Children's Home, a Victorian monstrosity that had stood on Beacon Hill for nearly a century. The building had been condemned 2 years prior, its brick facade crumbling, windows boarded up like blind eyes. "Let's get this over with," Jake called to his crew of 5 men. They'd been at it since dawn, gutting the interior before the scheduled dynamite demolition the following week. The city wanted the land for a new development, something modern to replace this relic of the past. The orphanage had closed in 1948 after a series of investigations into improper conditions. Jake didn't know the details, but rumors circulated among Boston's working class. Children disappearing. Strange noises at night. A director who ruled with an iron fist and biblical punishment. But that was all hearsay, the kind of stories that attached themselves to old buildings like moss. Jake led his crew through the main entrance, their boots echoing on the wooden floors. The interior smelled of mildew and something else, something sour that Jake couldn't place. Most of the furniture had been removed years ago, but odd items remained: a child-sized chair in a corner, a broken rocking horse, a singular roller skate. "Third floor today," Jake instructed. "We need to clear it before we tackle the attic tomorrow." The men trudged up the stairs, equipment in hand. The third floor had once housed dormitories, long rooms with rows of small beds. Now it was empty save for built-in cabinets and closets that needed to be torn out. "Charlie, take the sledgehammer to that wall." Jake pointed to a section that appeared to have been modified, newer plaster covering what might have been a doorway. "There might be a crawl space we need to check." Charlie, the youngest of the crew at 23, nodded and positioned himself. The first swing of the sledgehammer sent a cloud of dust into the air. The second created a hole. The third caused something unexpected. A portion of the ceiling directly above began to crack. "Hold up!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. With a sickening groan, a section of the ceiling collapsed. The men jumped back as debris rained down. But it wasn't just plaster and wood that fell. Small objects clattered to the floor around them, dozens of them bouncing and sliding across the wooden planks. Frank, the oldest worker, bent down and picked one up. His weathered face went pale. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, holding it up for the others to see. It was a tiny shoe, a child's shoe, worn and discolored with age. Then another man picked up a second one, and a third. As the dust settled, Jake realized with growing horror that small shoes, perhaps 50 or more, had been concealed in the space between the ceiling and the floor above. Some were simple leather shoes, others buckled dress shoes. A few were merely cloth slippers. "What the hell is this?" Charlie's voice cracked. Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding. He reached into the opening in the ceiling, his hand brushing against something that wasn't plaster or wood. He pulled it out, a small notebook, its pages yellow with age. Opening it with trembling fingers, he saw childish handwriting. "My name is Elizabeth Wheeler. I am 8 years old. Mrs. Blackwood says I am wicked. She takes our shoes when we try to run away. Please help us." The men fell silent, the only sound the distant honking of cars on Beacon Street, oblivious to what had just been discovered in this forgotten place where children had lived and suffered. "Call the police," Jake said quietly. "We need to call the police right now." Catherine Kit Sullivan was 27, ambitious and frustrated. Working at the Boston Globe meant fetching coffee more often than chasing stories, especially as one of the few female reporters. So when her editor, Bill Morrison, called her into his office 3 days after the discovery at the Blackwood Orphanage, she expected another assignment about fashion or recipes. Instead, Bill slid a folder across his desk. "The boys in crime beat are swamped with that bank robbery series. I need someone to follow up on this orphanage business." Kit tried to contain her excitement. "The shoes in the ceiling?" "Exactly. The police are being tight-lipped, but one of our photographers got some shots before they closed off the site. The demolition's on hold and people are asking questions. Find out what happened there." Kit spent the afternoon at the newspaper's archives, pulling every mention of the Blackwood Children's Home, founded in 1865 by Henrietta Blackwood, a wealthy widow who supposedly dedicated her fortune to orphan children. The home had operated continuously until 1948, when it closed abruptly following a city inspection. But the details were suspiciously sparse. No explanation for the closure beyond unsafe conditions. No account of where the remaining children were sent. No mention of investigations or charges. Just a small notice that the property had been transferred to the city. The next morning, Kit arrived at the orphanage site. Police tape surrounded the perimeter, but the demolition crew was gathered near their truck, smoking and talking in low voices. She approached them, notebook in hand. "Excuse me, I'm Catherine Sullivan from the Boston Globe. I'm hoping to speak with whoever was in charge when the discovery was made." A tall, dark-haired man in his 40s stepped forward. "That would be me. Jake Moretti, foreman." Kit noticed the dark circles under his eyes. "Could you tell me exactly what you found, Mr. Moretti?" Jake glanced at the building before answering. "We were breaking through a wall on the 3rd floor. The ceiling partially collapsed in double quotes." He hesitated. "Children's shoes fell out, dozens of them, hidden in the space between floors, and a notebook," added a younger worker. "A little girl's diary." Jake shot him a warning look. "The police have all that now." "Elizabeth Wheeler," Kit said, watching Jake's reaction. "That was her name, wasn't it?" Jake's eyes widened slightly. "How did you—" "I have sources," Kit lied smoothly. In truth, she'd overheard 2 officers discussing the case at a diner that morning. "Did any of you know this place was an orphanage? Did you hear stories about it?" The oldest worker, a man with gray hair and leathery skin, cleared his throat. "My uncle was a plumber, did some work here in the 30s. Said the woman who ran it, Blackwood's daughter, or granddaughter, I think, was a holy terror. Religious fanatic. Thought orphans were born from sin and needed salvation through suffering," Kit wrote rapidly. "Did he mention anything about missing children?" The man shook his head. "Not to me. But he quit the job halfway through. Said he couldn't stand the sound of crying." Kit thanked them and walked around the perimeter of the building, studying its imposing facade. The orphanage was 4 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture, all pointed arches and decorative stonework built to impress donors rather than comfort children. As she rounded the east side, she noticed an elderly woman watching from across the street. Kit approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you know this place when it was operating?" The woman clutched her handbag tighter. "I lived 2 blocks over for 60 years. We all knew to walk on the other side of the street." "Why is that?" "Sometimes at night you'd hear the singing, children's voices, but not happy singing, like hymns, but sad. And sometimes you'd see children at the windows just standing there watching, never playing, never laughing." The woman shivered despite the warm day. "Once I saw a little boy trying to climb down the drain pipe. Next day that window was boarded up." "Did you ever report anything?" The woman looked ashamed. "In those days you didn't interfere with discipline. The Blackwood family was powerful, connected to judges, politicians. Besides, they were saving those children, weren't they? At least that's what everyone said." As the woman walked away, Kit felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September breeze. She looked up at the orphanage's top-floor windows and, for just a moment, thought she saw a small face peering back at her. But that was impossible. The building had been empty for years. Detective Frank Callahan had been with Boston PD for 22 years, the last 7 in homicide. He'd seen terrible things: gangland executions, domestic murders, bodies pulled from the harbor, but nothing had disturbed him quite like the collection of children's shoes now spread across 3 tables in the evidence room, 57 shoes in total. Most for children between the ages of 5 and 10 based on their size. No matches among them, each representing a different child. Some showed signs of repair, others were worn through at the soles. All were decades old according to the preliminary examination. And then there was the notebook. Elizabeth Wheeler's careful childish script filled 10 pages with entries from 1931. The final entry simply read, "Mrs. Blackwood found my hiding place. She says I must go to the quiet room now. I'm so afraid." There were no records of an Elizabeth Wheeler ever leaving the orphanage. No adoption papers, no transfer to another institution, no death certificate. It was as if she had simply vanished. Callahan stood over the evidence, smoking his 3rd cigarette of the hour, when Officer Jenkins entered. "We got the records from City Hall, Detective. What's left of them, anyway?" "Looks like there was a fire in the records room in 49. Convenient timing." Callahan took the file. Most of the paperwork was mundane supply orders, donation receipts, staff payroll. But one document caught his attention, a letter from the city inspector dated March 1948, just before the orphanage closed. "Upon conducting our annual inspection of the Blackwood Children's Home, I find several concerning discrepancies between the reported number of children and residents 73 and those present during inspection 41. Director Agnes Blackwood attributes this to recent adoptions and transfers, but documentation for these children is incomplete." Quotes. Callahan frowned. 32 children unaccounted for, and they just shut the place down. "No investigation?" Jenkins shrugged. "Different times, sir, especially for orphans. Nobody looking for them, nobody missing them. Somebody should have been looking," Callahan muttered. "Get me everything on Agnes Blackwood, and find out if any staff from that time are still alive the next day." Callahan interviewed Marion Peters, a kitchen worker at the orphanage from 1940 to 1948. Now 70, she lived in a small apartment in Dorchester and seemed genuinely terrified to speak about her former employment. "I just cooked and cleaned," she said, hands trembling around her teacup. "I didn't ask questions." "But you must have noticed children disappearing," Callahan pressed. Marion stared into her tea. "Children came and went. Mrs. Blackwood handled all that. She said questioning God's plan was blasphemy." "Did you ever hear of a girl named Elizabeth Wheeler?" Marion's cup clattered against the saucer. "I don't recall specific names. She would have been there in 1931, before your time. But her diary was found hidden in the building, along with shoes. Children's shoes hidden between floors. The shoes," Marion whispered, her face ashen. "She took their shoes." "Mrs. Blackwood?" Marion nodded slowly. "When children misbehaved, tried to run away or broke the rules, she took their shoes. Said no child could escape God's judgment in their bare feet." She looked up at Callahan, eyes brimming with tears. "But some did try to run. The desperate ones. What happened to them?" "Mrs. Blackwood would catch them. Always. And then, the quiet room." Marion's voice dropped to a whisper. "In the attic, children went in, but sometimes they didn't come out. And nobody reported this. She was a Blackwood. Her father was a judge. Her brother was on the governor's staff. Who would believe us against them? Besides, these were orphans. Unwanted children. Nobody came looking." Callahan leaned forward. "What exactly happened in the quiet room, Mrs. Peters?" Marion stood abruptly. "I've said too much. I need you to leave now." As Callahan drove back to the station, Marion's words echoed in his mind. The quiet room. Children who didn't come out. He made a decision and redirected his car toward Beacon Hill. The orphanage stood silent and forbidding in the afternoon sun. Callahan showed his badge to the officer guarding the site and ducked under the police tape. He needed to see the attic, the quiet room for himself. The interior was cool and dark, dust motes dancing in the beams of light from boarded windows. Callahan climbed the stairs, each creaking step adding to his growing sense of dread. Third floor, then a narrower staircase to the attic. The attic ran the length of the building, low-ceilinged and oppressive. Empty now except for a few broken chairs and trunks. But at the far end was a door-heavy wood with a sliding bolt on the outside. The quiet room. Callahan approached slowly, flashlight illuminating his path. The door was small child-sized. He slid back the bolt and pulled it open. The space beyond was tiny, perhaps 6 feet square, with no windows. The walls were covered with scratches marks that could have been made by small fingernails. And on the floor, barely visible beneath decades of dust, were more tiny scratches. Words. Callahan knelt down, brushing away the dust with his handkerchief. "Help us, Mommy, please. God forgive me." And in one corner, in careful letters, Elizabeth Wheeler, 1931. Callahan stood, bile rising in his throat. Whatever had happened at the Blackwood orphanage, he was now certain of one thing. It wasn't just neglect or harsh discipline, it was something far worse. And the shoes hidden in the ceiling weren't just trophies. They were evidence. Howard Jenkins had worked as caretaker for the Blackwood property since 1950, 2 years after the orphanage closed. At 72, he lived in a small groundskeeper's cottage behind the main building, supposedly maintaining the property until the city decided its fate. In reality, Howard's main job had been to keep people out and secrets in. He watched from his window as police and reporters swarmed around the building. They'd find more, he knew. The shoes were just the beginning. And when they did, the Blackwood Trust would expect him to uphold his end of the bargain, 50 years of silence in exchange for a comfortable retirement. But Howard was dying. The doctor had given him 3 months, maybe 4, lung cancer. All those years of silence weighed on him now, heavier than the disease in his chest. When the female reporter from the Globe knocked on his door, he surprised himself by inviting her in. "Mr. Jenkins? I'm Catherine Sullivan. I'm writing a story about the orphanage." Howard gestured to a chair. "I figured someone would come around eventually. What do you want to know?" Kit seemed taken aback by his willingness. "You worked here after the orphanage closed?" "Caretaker. 54 years next month. Though I doubt I'll see that anniversary. Did you ever find anything unusual during your time here?" Howard laughed, a sound that turned into a hacking cough. "Lady, there's nothing usual about this place. But if you're asking about the shoes, no. They kept those well hidden. That Blackwood Trust, Agnes Blackwood's nephews, They paid me to maintain the property and keep quiet about anything I might find. He gestured around his sparse cottage. Not that they paid well, mind you. Kit leaned forward. What were you supposed to keep quiet about, Mr. Jenkins? Howard was silent for a long moment. I wasn't the first caretaker. First guy quit after a month. Said he heard children crying at night. Second one lasted 6 months before he had some kind of breakdown. When they hired me, they were specific: don't go in the attic, don't dig in the garden, and don't ask questions. But you did. Howard nodded slowly. Curiosity gets the better of fear eventually. I went in the attic my first year, found that little room, saw the scratches, figured out what it was for. What was it for, Mr. Jenkins? Punishment, isolation, maybe worse. I locked that room up and didn't go back for 20 years. Howard stared into the middle distance. But the noises, those I couldn't avoid. Noises? At night. Soft footsteps. Children whispering. Sometimes singing, real quiet like. I told myself it was the building settling, or rats, or my imagination. But but you didn't believe that. Kit finished for him. Hard to ignore it when you see them, Howard said matter-of-factly. Kit stiffened. See who? The children. Glimpses, mostly. A face at a window, a small shadow moving down a hallway. Once a little girl standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me. She didn't have any shoes. Kit tried to keep her voice steady. Do you believe in ghosts, Mr. Jenkins? Didn't used to. Now I'm not so sure, but I know what Agnes Blackwood believed. Howard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn book. Found this in her office after I started. Her personal diary. Kit took it with trembling hands. Have you shown this to the police? Not yet. Wanted to know what I was dealing with first. It's not easy reading. Kit opened the diary carefully. The handwriting was sharp and angular, the words pressing deep into the paper as if written with suppressed violence. March 15th, 1931, Kit read aloud. Elizabeth continues to defy me. Found her attempting to post a letter through that meddlesome milk delivery boy. She claims mistreatment, as if structure and discipline are cruelty. The child is corrupted by wickedness from birth, all these children are. The quiet room may not be sufficient for her salvation. Kit looked up, horrified. This is about the same Elizabeth from the notebook. Howard nodded grimly. Keep reading. March 20th, 1931. Elizabeth escaped the quiet room somehow. Found her trying to climb from a third-floor window. The fall would surely have killed her, though perhaps that would have been God's mercy. I have moved her to the special chamber beneath the garden shed. No light enters there. In darkness, perhaps she will finally see. Kit's voice faltered. There's a chamber under the garden shed? Howard stood with difficulty. Come with me. They walked slowly across the overgrown grounds to a dilapidated wooden shed. Howard produced an old key and unlocked the rusted padlock. I only came here once, he said, after I read the diary. Needed to see if it was true. Inside, the shed was empty except for a few broken tools. Howard moved to the corner and pulled back a threadbare rug, revealing a trapdoor with an iron ring. I don't have the strength to open it anymore, he said. Kit hesitated, then knelt and pulled on the ring. The door lifted with a groan, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. There's a flashlight on that shelf, Howard said. I'll wait here. Kit took the flashlight and began the descent, heart hammering. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom was a small chamber, perhaps 8 feet square, with earthen walls and floor. No windows, no light source. The ceiling was so low she had to stoop. The beam of her flashlight revealed markings on the walls, childish drawings, names, dates, and in one corner a small pile of bones, child-sized bones. Kit backed up the stairs, gasping for air. Howard stood watching her, his expression grim. You found her, he said. It wasn't a question. There are human remains down there, Kit managed. We need to call the police immediately. Howard nodded. Agnes Blackwood's diary has entries about 14 children who were sent to the Chamber of Reflection. Elizabeth was the first. The last was in 1947, just before the inspection that shut them down. But why? How could anyone do this to children? Howard's expression darkened. Agnes believed orphans were born in sin, that their parents' wickedness flowed in their veins. She saw herself as their salvation. The diary talks about purifying their souls through isolation and contemplation. Those who repented were eventually released. Those who didn't, single quotes, got quotes. Kit felt sick. And no one stopped her? The Blackwood family protected their own. When inspectors came, troublesome children were hidden away. Those who asked too many questions were sent to other institutions. Staff who objected were fired and discredited. Howard coughed violently into a handkerchief. The whole system was designed to make these children disappear. And the shoes, trophies, I think, or evidence she needed to destroy but couldn't bring herself to. Agnes Blackwood was a monster, but in her mind, she was doing God's work. As they walked back toward the cottage, Kit noticed Howard was wheezing heavily. "Are you all right, Mr. Jenkins?" "Dying," he said bluntly. "Lung cancer, 3 months at best. Which is why I'm talking to you now. Someone needs to know the truth." "I'll make sure everyone knows," Kit promised. Howard looked back at the orphanage, its dark windows like accusing eyes. "You know, the strangest thing? After they found those shoes, the noises stopped. No more footsteps, no more whispers. Like the children were finally being heard." The morning after Kit's discovery, Beacon Hill awoke to the sound of police sirens. Detective Callahan had ordered a full excavation of the garden shed area, bringing in forensic experts from the state crime lab. The story had broken wide open. The Boston Globe's front page headline read, "Horror at Blackwood. Child remains found on orphanage grounds." Kit watched from behind the police line as officers carefully removed earth from around the underground chamber. By midday, they had uncovered not just Elizabeth Wheeler's remains, but a second chamber adjacent to the first, containing 3 more sets of small bones. Dr. Margaret Chun, the forensic anthropologist overseeing the recovery, approached Callahan and Kit, her expression grave. "Based on preliminary examination, these remains belong to children between 5 and 12 years old. The oldest has been here at least 20 years, the most recent perhaps 7 or 8 years, right around when the orphanage closed." "Cause of death?" Callahan asked. Dr. Chun shook her head. "Difficult to determine at this stage, but there's no obvious trauma to the bones. Given the circumstances, starvation or dehydration seems likely, or possibly suffocation if these chambers were sealed." Kit thought of the dark, airless space she'd entered. "They would have been terrified. There's something else," Dr. Chun added. "We found a 5th set of remains that doesn't fit the pattern. Adult female, approximately 60 to 70 years old at time of death, buried beneath the floor of the shed itself, not in the chambers." Callahan frowned. "Agnes Blackwood? Possibly. Records show she disappeared in 1949, supposedly moved to a family estate in Vermont. The body was wrapped in blankets, not a proper burial. And there's evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull." Kit and Callahan exchanged glances. "Someone killed her and hid the body," Kit said. "After the orphanage closed," Callahan added, "when the property was supposedly empty. By late afternoon, police had expanded their search to the entire grounds. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbing anomalies in the soil behind the East Wing regular depressions that suggested more burial sites. The media descended on Beacon Hill. Television crews set up opposite the orphanage, reporters jostling for the best angle. Former residents of the neighborhood gave interviews, many admitting they'd had suspicions about the orphanage for years but had remained silent. Kit found herself thrust into the spotlight as the reporter who'd broken the story. Her editor, Bill Morrison, had promoted her to lead investigative reporter on the case. "This could be the biggest story to hit Boston since the Brinks robbery," he told her. "Stay on it." As dusk fell, Kit sat on a bench across from the orphanage, watching the floodlights illuminate the excavation. Jake Moretti, the demolition foreman, approached and sat beside her. "They're saying there might be more bodies," he said quietly. "All around the property." Kit nodded. "The radar found at least 12 anomalies consistent with graves." "Jesus." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "You know what keeps getting me? Those shoes. They were hidden but not thrown away, like she wanted to keep them close." "Trophies," Kit said. "Howard Jenkins. The caretaker thinks they were trophies. Or maybe she couldn't let them go," Jake suggested. "Maybe in her twisted mind she still thought she was saving those kids." Kit considered this. The diary entry suggests she believed she was doing religious work, purifying their souls. By locking them underground until they died? By isolating them until they saw the light, as she put it. Those who repented were released. Those who did in single quotes to a bull quotes. Kit didn't need to finish the sentence. Jake shook his head, and nobody stopped her. "All those years. People suspected," Kit said. "But the Blackwood family was powerful, connected, and these were orphans' children nobody was looking for." "Someone should have been looking," Jake said, echoing Detective Callahan's words from days earlier. As darkness fell completely, Kit noticed something strange. Small groups of people had begun gathering at the police line, not reporters or curious onlookers, but older men and women, many in their 60s or 70s. They stood silently, watching the excavation with solemn expressions. "Who are they?" Jake asked. Kit approached one elderly man who leaned heavily on a cane. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Catherine Sullivan from the Boston Globe. May I ask why you're here tonight?" The man turned rheumy eyes toward her. I was here from 1915 to 1923. Blackwood Children's Home. He gestured to the others. Words getting around. We're coming to bear witness. Kit looked at the growing crowd with dawning understanding. You're all former residents? The man nodded. Survivors. The lucky ones. He pointed toward the excavation site. We came for them. The ones who didn't get out. By midnight, over 50 former orphanage residents had gathered, forming a silent vigil as the excavation continued through the night under floodlights. Some held candles. Others clutched small personal items, a doll, a book, a photograph. Many wept quietly. As the first body was carefully removed from the ground behind the east wing, an elderly woman in the crowd began to sing softly. Others joined in. A simple hymn, but somehow transformed into something haunting and mournful. The same hymn, Kit realized with a chill, that neighbors had reported hearing from the orphanage at night all those years ago. The discovery of multiple graves on the orphanage grounds sent shockwaves through Boston. Mayor John Collins called an emergency press conference, promising a full investigation and accountability for any city officials who had turned a blind eye to the Blackwood atrocities. Meanwhile, Kit had turned her attention to the public records. If Agnes Blackwood had been systematically abusing and killing children, there had to be a paper trail: missing persons reports, death certificates, inspection records. The city clerk's office was cooperative but overwhelmed. The 1949 fire in the records room had destroyed many documents relating to city orphanages and children's homes. What remained was fragmented and incomplete. Kit spent days sifting through dusty files, compiling names, dates, and discrepancies. By the end of the week, she had constructed a timeline of the Blackwood Children's Home from its founding in 1865 to its closure in 1948. The pattern was disturbing. Every year, approximately 80 to 100 children were listed as residents. Every year, 10 to 15 were recorded as transferred, adopted, or relocated, always without specific details about their destinations. Between 1910 and 1948, over 500 children had effectively vanished from the official record. Kit presented her findings to Detective Callahan in his office at police headquarters. 500 kids, Callahan said, staring at her notes. We've found 17 bodies so far. Where are the rest? Not all of them were murdered, Kit pointed out. Howard Jenkins said Agnes only sent the incorrigible ones to the underground chambers. Others might have been genuinely adopted or transferred, or disposed of elsewhere, Callahan said grimly. We're expanding the search to the entire property tomorrow, bringing in cadaver dogs. Kit hesitated, then pulled out Agnes Blackwood's diary. I've been reading more of this. The later entries are different, more paranoid. She talks about hearing the children at night, the dead ones. Says they're singing accusations against her. The woman was clearly deranged. Yes, but there's something else. In 1948, right before the orphanage closed, she mentions a staff member named Martha Wilson who betrayed her by speaking to inspectors. Then Martha disappears from the diary. No further mention. Callahan leaned forward. You think Agnes killed her? I think it's worth looking into what happened to Martha Wilson. And I think I know who might remember her. The next day, Kit visited St. Mary's nursing home in Dorchester, where Marion Peters, the former kitchen worker, now resided. Marion had been hospitalized after her interview with Detective Callahan, suffering from what doctors called acute anxiety. Mrs. Peters? I'm Catherine Sullivan from the Boston Globe. I'd like to talk to you about Martha Wilson. Marion's face paled. How do you know that name? Agnes Blackwood's diary. Alpha spoke to inspectors in 1948, didn't she? She's the reason the orphanage was finally investigated. Marion stared out the window for a long moment. Martha was a nurse. Came to work at Blackwood in 1946. Young, idealistic, thought she could help the children. She paused. She saw things. The quiet room. Children who disappeared. She kept records. A little notebook where she wrote down names, dates, what happened to her. She went to the city inspector. A week later, Mrs. Blackwood accused her of stealing. Had her fired, blacklisted from nursing in Massachusetts. Marion's hands trembled. But Martha didn't leave Boston. She kept watching the orphanage. Kept notes. Said she was going to find proof, and did she? I don't know. Last time I saw her was April 1949. She said she had evidence that would bring down the whole Blackwood empire. Next day, she vanished. Police said she'd probably left town, but her apartment was still full of her things, and her notebook was gone. Kit thought of the adult female remains found buried under the garden shed. Mrs. Peters, did Martha Wilson have any distinguishing features? Something that might identify her remains? Marion looked sharply at Kit. You found her. It wasn't a question. Martha had a steel pin in her right ankle. Childhood injury. And she always wore a small silver cross. Kit made notes, her heart racing. Who would have wanted to silence Martha? Agnes Blackwood was already gone by then. Not gone, Marion said quietly. Hidden. After the orphanage closed, the Blackwood family claimed Agnes had moved to their estate in Vermont. But staff whispered that she refused to leave, said she needed to stay close to her children. The family was embarrassed, worried she'd say too much. They kept her in the caretaker's cottage, out of sight. So Agnes was still on the property when Martha disappeared. Kit said slowly. But why kill her a year after the orphanage closed? What could Martha have found? Marion leaned forward, lowering her voice. The records. The real records. Agnes kept a separate set of books names, punishments, what happened to each child. Martha was convinced they existed. Said finding them was the only way to get justice. Kit thought of the diary entries about children hearing singing accusations. Agnes was becoming paranoid near the end. If Martha confronted her alone... Agnes wasn't the only Blackwood with something to lose, Marion interrupted. Her nephews, Judge William Blackwood and State Senator James Blackwood, they were on the orphanage board. They knew what was happening. They protected her for years. The pieces were falling into place. So when Martha found proof that implicated the whole family... they silenced her, Marion finished. And probably Agnes, too, once she became a liability. Kit stood. Mrs. Peters, would you be willing to make a formal statement to the police about this? Marion hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm 70 years old. What can they do to me now? As Kit left the nursing home, she called Detective Callahan from a payphone. I think I know who our adult victim is, and I think I know why she was killed. But more importantly, I think I know where to find the records that could break this case wide open. Where? Callahan asked. The Blackwood family estate in Brookline. If Agnes kept detailed records of what happened to those children, and if Martha Wilson found them, that's where the family would have hidden them after silencing both women. Sullivan, we can't just raid a sitting judge's home on speculation. Then we need to find proof that links the Blackwood family directly to the orphanage crimes. Something that would justify a search warrant. And how do we do that? Kit smiled grimly. By talking to the one person who knows all of the Blackwood family secrets. The man they've been paying for 50 years to keep quiet. Howard Jenkins was packing his meager belongings when Kit arrived at his cottage. The cancer had progressed rapidly. His skin had a gray pallor, and he needed oxygen to breathe. They're moving me to Veterans Hospital tomorrow, he explained. Doctors say it's weeks now, not months. I need to ask you about the Blackwood family, Kit said. Not just Agnes, but her nephews, William and James. Howard sat heavily on his bed. What about them? Did they visit the property after the orphanage closed? When Agnes was supposedly living here in secret? Howard nodded slowly. Every month like clockwork. Brought her groceries, medicine, made sure she stayed out of sight. Did they ever bring anything to store here? Documents, files, records? Howard's eyes narrowed. How did you know about that? Kit's heart raced. What did they bring, Mr. Jenkins? Trunks, 3 of them. Heavy. They came at night about a week after the orphanage closed. Told me never to open them, just to keep them safe. He pointed to a trapdoor in the floor of his cottage. Down there. I never looked inside. Part of our arrangement. Kit helped Howard move a rug, revealing a trapdoor similar to the one in the garden shed, but smaller. Together they managed to pull it open. Below was a small cellar, perhaps 8 feet square. 3 large trunks sat in the darkness. May I? Kit asked. Howard gestured weakly. Nothing matters much to me now. Kit descended the short ladder. The trunks were old-fashioned steamer trunks, each secured with a padlock. Do you have the keys? Howard shook his head. Never had them. That was intentional. Kit examined the locks. They were old and rusted, probably not difficult for police to open. She climbed back up. Mr. Jenkins, Detective Callahan needs to see these. Would you be willing to make a statement about how they came to be here? Howard considered this. The Blackwoods promised me a pension for my silence. 50 years of keeping secrets, but they never paid what they promised. And now I'm dying with nothing to show for it. He met Kit's eyes. Yes, I'll tell Callahan everything. It's time. 3 hours later, Detective Callahan stood in Howard Jenkins' cellar with a locksmith and 2 evidence technicians. The first trunk had been opened, revealing hundreds of files, organized alphabetically, detailed records of every child who had passed through the Blackwood orphanage from 1910 to 1948. My God, Callahan murmured, carefully lifting a file labeled Wheeler. Elizabeth B. Inside were photographs, medical reports, handwritten notes documenting the girl's infractions and corrections. The final entry, dated March 22, 1931, simply stated, "Subject expired during spiritual reflection. Remains interred in garden meditation chamber number 1. They documented everything, Kit said, horrified. Every punishment, every death. And the Blackwood brothers knew, Callahan added. They helped hide the evidence. The next morning, Judge William Blackwood and former state senator James Blackwood were arrested at their respective homes. The Boston Globe's headline read, "Blackwood Brothers Arrested. Orphanage Death Records Found." The trial of William and James Blackwood began on a cold January morning in 1955, 4 months after the discovery of the shoes in the orphanage ceiling. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. Many former residents of the orphanage stood silently holding candles despite the biting wind. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Kit sat in the press section, notebook ready. This was the biggest story of her career, a series of articles that had shocked Boston and earned her a Pulitzer nomination. The charges were severe: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact to the deaths of at least 23 children and 2 adults, Martha Wilson and Agnes Blackwood herself. The prosecution's case was built on the meticulously kept records found in Howard Jenkins' cellar. The first trunk contained files on every child. The second held financial records showing the brothers had diverted orphanage funds to their personal accounts. The third contained correspondence proving they had actively covered up Agnes Blackwood's crimes for years. Most damning was a letter from William to James dated April 1949. "M.W. confronted me with evidence today. Claims she will go to the press. This situation must be resolved immediately. A. has become unstable and is a liability. Suggests we handle both problems at once and close this chapter permanently." The defense tried to argue that Agnes had acted alone, that the brothers had been unaware of her actions, but former staff members, including Marion Peters, testified that the brothers had regularly visited the orphanage, had seen the conditions, and had dismissed complaints. Howard Jenkins testified from a wheelchair, an oxygen tank beside him. His testimony was devastating, describing how the brothers had hidden Agnes at the property after the orphanage closed, how they had brought the trunks of evidence for safekeeping, and how they had paid him for his silence. "They told me if I ever spoke about what happened at Blackwood, they would make sure I ended up like Martha Wilson," he testified. "They said no one would miss an old caretaker." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The defense called character witnesses colleagues who spoke of the brothers' community standing and philanthropy, but these testimonials withered under cross-examination when confronted with the brothers' decades of complicity. On the final day of the trial, Dr. Margaret Chun presented her forensic findings. The remains found on the orphanage grounds included 23 children, ranging in age from 5 to 12. Cause of death in most cases appeared to be starvation or dehydration. Martha Wilson's remains were identified by the steel pin in her ankle and the silver cross found with her body. Agnes Blackwood was identified through dental records. Based on fracture patterns to Agnes Blackwood's skull, Dr. Chun testified. She was struck from behind with considerable force, consistent with a shovel or similar implement. Martha Wilson suffered similar injuries, suggesting the same perpetrator. As the jury deliberated, Kit interviewed former residents who had attended the trial. Many spoke of nightmares that had haunted them for decades, of children they had known who disappeared, of the fear that had shaped their lives. "We always knew something terrible was happening to the kids who got taken to the quiet room," said Robert Davis, who had lived at the orphanage from 1940 to 1945. "But we were children. Who would believe us against the Blackwoods?" After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. "On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendants guilty. On the count of accessory after the fact to murder, we find the defendants guilty." Judge Harrison Finch sentenced William and James Blackwood to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As they were led away, James Blackwood turned to glare at Kit, his expression one of pure hatred. Outside the courthouse, the former residents embraced each other, many in tears. For them, the verdict represented a validation they had never expected to receive, an acknowledgement of suffering long denied. Kit approached Robert Davis, who stood slightly apart from the others. "Mr. Davis, what happens now? For all of you?" Davis looked thoughtful. "For 40 years I've dreamed of children singing in the dark. I thought I was going crazy. Now I know they were real. They were my friends." He glanced toward the sky where snow had begun to fall. "Maybe now they can rest. Maybe now we all can." 6 months after the Blackwood trial, Kit stood in what had once been the orphanage garden. The building itself had finally been demolished, the rubble cleared away. In its place was a construction site, the beginnings of a public memorial and small museum dedicated to the children who had suffered and died there. The project had been championed by a coalition of former residents, who had fought city plans to simply build commercial space on the property. Their testimony before the city council had been powerful and undeniable. "This ground is sacred," Robert Davis had told the council. "It holds the memories and remains of children whose lives were stolen. We owe them this much to be remembered." Kit walked among the wooden stakes marking the foundation of the future memorial. A central courtyard would feature a bronze sculpture of children's shoes, designed by a renowned artist who had herself grown up in foster care. Surrounding walls would bear the names of every child known to have passed. Through the Blackwood orphanage, over 2,000 names compiled from the recovered records. "It's really happening," said a voice behind her. Kit turned to see Jake Moretti, the demolition foreman whose crew had first discovered the shoes. He looked different now, less haunted, more at peace. "You're still involved with the project?" Kit asked. Jake nodded. "Volunteering my time to oversee the construction. Seems right somehow. My crew and I started this journey. We should see it through." He gestured to the site. "We're being careful, treating the ground with respect." Kit looked at her watch. "The ceremony starts soon. Are you staying?" "Would miss it." They walked together to the street where a crowd had gathered. Former residents, many now elderly, stood alongside city officials and members of the public. Howard Jenkins was notably absent. He had succumbed to his cancer 2 weeks after the trial ended, his testimony having helped secure justice for the children he had failed to protect in life. At noon, Mayor Collins stepped forward to address the gathering. "Today we begin the process of remembering and honoring the children of the Blackwood orphanage. For too long, their suffering was ignored, their voices silenced. This memorial will ensure that Boston never forgets them or the failures of those entrusted with their care." Robert Davis unveiled the cornerstone of the memorial, a simple granite block inscribed with the words, "For the children of Blackwood. You were not forgotten." Beneath the inscription was a small bronze shoe, cast from one of those found in the orphanage ceiling. As the ceremony concluded, Kit noticed an elderly woman standing apart from the crowd, leaning heavily on a cane. Something in her expression caught Kit's attention, a mix of grief and something else. Recognition, perhaps. Kit approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Did you have a connection to the orphanage?" The woman studied Kit for a moment before answering. "My sister was here." "Elizabeth Wheeler." Kit's breath caught. Elizabeth, the girl whose diary had been found with the shoes, whose remains had been among the first discovered. "I'm Catherine Sullivan from the Boston Globe. I've written about Elizabeth. I know who you are," the woman said. "I've read your articles. My name is Margaret Wheeler Davis. I was only 3 when Elizabeth was sent here. Our parents died in a fire. I was adopted quickly, young enough to be wanted. Elizabeth was 8. Too old, they said." "I'm so sorry," Kit said softly. "I didn't know what happened to her until I was grown. My adoptive parents never told me I had a sister. I found out by accident, going through old papers after they died. Spent years searching, but no one would tell me anything about Blackwood. Now I know why." Kit hesitated. "Elizabeth kept a diary. It was found hidden in the building. Would you like to see it?" Margaret nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I would like that very much." Kit had brought the diary to the ceremony, sensing it belonged here today. She took it from her bag and carefully handed it to Margaret. She was brave. She tried to tell people what was happening. Margaret opened the small notebook, tracing her sister's handwriting with trembling fingers. She loved to write. Even as a little girl, she was always making up stories. She looked up at Kit. "Thank you for finding her, for making sure she wasn't forgotten." As the crowd dispersed, Kit saw Jake talking with a group of former residents near the construction site. One elderly man pointed to an area near what had been the East Wing, gesturing emphatically. Jake listened intently, making notes. "They're sharing memories," Margaret explained, following Kit's gaze. "Helping to make sure the memorial is accurate. Does it help?" Kit asked. "Being here, talking about it?" "Some wounds never heal completely," Margaret said. "But being acknowledged, being believed, that matters more than you can imagine." As twilight fell, most people had left. Kit remained, watching as workers covered the excavation site with tarpaulins. The wind had picked up, carrying the first hint of autumn chill. From somewhere nearby came the sound of children's voices, students from a local school walking home, laughing and calling to each other. The sound echoed across the empty lot where the orphanage had stood. Kit thought of Elizabeth Wheeler and the other children whose lives had ended in darkness and isolation. They had been silenced once, their cries unheard, their suffering ignored. But now their stories would be told, their names remembered. She had done what journalists are meant to do, given voice to those who had none, and in doing so, perhaps helped their spirits find some measure of peace. 1 year to the day after the shoes fell from the orphanage ceiling. The Blackwood Children's Memorial opened to the public. The October weather was crisp and clear, the trees on Beacon Hill aflame with autumn colors. Kit arrived early, walking the perimeter before the crowds arrived. The memorial was beautiful in its simplicity, a circular courtyard surrounded by stone walls inscribed with names. In the center stood the bronze sculpture, a spiral of children's shoes, each cast from one of those found in the ceiling, rising toward the sky. Around the courtyard, a small museum displayed photographs, documents, and personal items donated by former residents. One glass case held Elizabeth Wheeler's diary, open to her final entry. Beside it lay the notebook Martha Wilson had kept, recording the names of children who disappeared. Kit had continued reporting on the story throughout the year. Her series, The Lost Children of Blackwood, had won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative journalism. More importantly, it had led to a statewide review of childcare institutions and the establishment of stricter oversight protocols. The memorial dedication ceremony drew hundreds of attendees. Former residents, now organized as the Blackwood Survivors Association, led the proceedings. Robert Davis, their unofficial spokesperson, addressed the gathering. "We stand today on ground that witnessed terrible suffering. We transform it now into a place of remembrance and healing. For those of us who survived Blackwood, this memorial acknowledges a pain that many tried to force us to forget. For those who did not survive, it ensures they will never again be hidden away, forgotten in darkness." After the ceremony, Kit wandered through the museum, observing visitors' reactions. Many were visibly moved, some to tears, others stood in silent contemplation before the displays. In a quiet corner, she found Margaret Wheeler Davis seated on a bench, gazing at the sculpture in the courtyard. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Margaret said as Kit joined her. Elizabeth would have approved. She always found beauty in small things. "How are you doing with all this?" Kit asked. "Some days are harder than others, but having a place to come to acknowledge her, it helps." Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew a small object, offering it to Kit. "I wanted you to have this." It was a tiny shoe charm on a silver chain, an exact miniature of the sculpture. "The Survivors Association had these made for those who helped bring the truth to light," Margaret explained. "Without you, Elizabeth might never have been found. None of them would have." Kit accepted the necklace, deeply touched. "I was just doing my job. You did more than that. You listened when others wouldn't. You believed when others doubted." Margaret stood slowly. "I should go. My daughter's waiting for me." "You named your daughter Elizabeth, didn't you?" Kit had learned this during one of their previous conversations. Margaret smiled. "Yes, she's bringing her children today. Elizabeth's great-nieces and nephews, 3 generations removed from the tragedy, but still connected to it, still remembering." After Margaret left, Kit continued through the museum. In the research room at the back, visitors could access digitized copies of the Blackwood records, part of the city's commitment to transparency about this dark chapter in its history. Jake Moretti was there, helping an elderly man navigate the archive system. He spotted Kit and excused himself. "Quite a turnout," he said. "The mayor's office says they've had visitors from across the country." "I'm not surprised," Kit replied. The Blackwood case struck a chord. It wasn't just about one orphanage in Boston. It was about how society treats its most vulnerable members. About who gets believed and who gets ignored. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "You know, my crew and I have worked dozens of demolition jobs over the years. Old buildings always have secrets, hidden rooms, walled-up doorways, forgotten spaces, but I've never found anything like those shoes." He paused. "Sometimes I wonder if we were meant to find them. If those children were waiting for someone to finally hear them." "Do you believe in ghosts, Mr. Moretti?" Kit asked, echoing the question she had once asked Howard Jenkins. "I believe some stories refuse to stay buried," Jake answered. "And I believe that sometimes the past reaches out to the present, demanding justice." As evening approached, the crowds thinned. Kit remained, watching as staff prepared to close for the day. The setting sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, illuminating the bronze shoes with golden light. In that moment of silence, with the day visitors gone and the night yet to arrive, Kit thought she heard something, the faintest sound of children's voices. Not crying or moaning as ghost stories might suggest, but laughing, playing, free. A staff member approached. "We're closing soon, Miss Sullivan." "Of course." Kit gathered her things. "Will you be open tomorrow?" "Every day," the woman replied. That was the promise, that this place would remain open, accessible to all, that the children would never again be hidden away. Kit took one last look at the memorial as she left. The bronze shoes caught the last rays of sunlight, seeming almost to move in the gathering dusk, as if the children who had once worn them were finally running free. 5 years after the opening of the Blackwood Memorial, Kit Sullivan sat in her office at the Boston Globe, now the paper's senior investigative reporter. She'd covered stories across the country, but none had affected her as deeply as Blackwood. On her desk lay a letter from the Massachusetts Department of Child Welfare. It was an invitation to speak at the dedication of a new state-of-the-art children's home, one designed with input from child psychology experts, former foster children, and advocates. It would be called the Wheeler House, after Elizabeth. The Blackwood case had catalyzed change far beyond Boston. Nationwide reforms in orphanage and foster care oversight had been implemented. Regular inspections, stricter background checks for staff, and ombudsmen, to whom children could report concerns, were now standard practice. The Blackwood Survivors Association had become a powerful advocacy group, testifying before Congress and consulting on child care policy. Many former residents had broken decades of silence, sharing their experiences to ensure such abuses could never again remain hidden. William and James Blackwood had died in prison, William of a heart attack in 1957, James of pneumonia in 1958. They had taken some secrets to their graves, including the full extent of their knowledge about Agnes Blackwood's crimes. But the evidence they had so carefully hidden had ensured their guilt was never in doubt. The memorial site had become one of Boston's most visited locations. School groups, tourists, and history students came daily. More importantly, it had become a place of pilgrimage for former orphans and foster children from across the country, a rare public acknowledgement of a suffering, often invisible to society. Kit's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jake Moretti, now the owner of his own construction company specializing in historical renovation. "Sullivan, you're not going to believe this," he said without preamble. "Remember I told you we were working on that old church in Dorchester? St. Cecilia's, the one being converted to apartments? What about it? We found something in the bell tower, a metal box sealed up inside a wall. Looks like it's been there since the 40s. And guess what was written on it? Blackwood." Kit sat up straight. "Have you opened it? Waiting for you? And Detective Callahan, well, Captain Callahan now. Thought you'd both want to be here." An hour later, Kit stood in the dusty bell tower of St. Cecilia's Church. Captain Frank Callahan, recently promoted to head of homicide, was already there, as was Margaret Wheeler Davis, now serving as the president of the Blackwood Survivors Association. The church had connections to the Blackwood family, Jake explained as they gathered around a small table where the metal box sat. Agnes Blackwood's father was a major donor in the 1890s. The priest who served here from 1920 to 1951, Father Thomas Riley, was her second cousin. A family church, Callahan mused. Convenient, the box was about the size of a bread loaf made of copper that had turned green with age. Across the top, someone had scratched Blackwood in uneven letters. "Should we wait for the police evidence team?" Jake asked. Callahan shook his head. "This isn't a crime scene. Whatever's in there is historical record now." With careful hands, Jake pried open the lid. Inside were several items: a small leather-bound book, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a silver locket, and a folded sheet of paper that appeared to be a map. "Martha Wilson's handwriting," Margaret said immediately, recognizing it from the documents displayed in the Memorial Museum. "These must be the records she collected before she confronted the Blackwoods." Kit carefully opened the book. It was a register of sorts with dates, names, and notations. These are children who were supposedly adopted or transferred, but who Martha suspected had actually died at the orphanage. There are over 100 names here going back to 1910. "Far more than we found remains for," Callahan noted grimly. "She maps locations," Kit said, unfolding the paper. "Not just the garden chambers and the East Wing graves we found. There are markings all over the property, under the main building foundation, the west garden, even extending into what was then the neighboring property. There were more bodies we never found," Jake said, his voice hollow. "Many more." Margaret opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, with solemn eyes and braided hair. On the back was etched a single name: Elizabeth. "My sister," Margaret whispered. Martha must have known her. The letters, when carefully unfolded, revealed correspondence between Martha Wilson and a reporter at the Boston Herald named John Mackey. In them, Martha detailed her suspicions about the Blackwood orphanage and her efforts to gather evidence. The final letter, dated 3 days before her disappearance, read, "I have compiled sufficient documentation to prove systematic abuse and numerous deaths at Blackwood. Agnes is increasingly unstable, talking to children who aren't there. The Blackwood brothers are moving to silence her. I fear they will come for me next. I'm hiding copies of my evidence in several locations. If you don't hear from me by Friday, please alert the authorities. The children deserve justice." John Mackey had apparently never received this letter. A note attached in different handwriting explained, "Found among John Mackey's effects after his sudden death. Heart attack, May 1949. They got to him too, Callahan said. Convenient heart attack. But Martha outsmarted them, Kit realized. She hid multiple copies of her evidence. The Blackwoods found one, maybe two, but they missed this one. Margaret held the locket tightly. She's still speaking for the children, still fighting for them. They decided the materials should go to the Blackwood Memorial Museum to be preserved and studied. The map would be given to the city archaeological department to determine if further excavation was warranted to recover any remaining remains. As they carefully packed the items, Kit reflected on how a story was never truly finished. 5 years after the shoes fell from the ceiling, the Blackwood case continued to reveal new chapters, new victims, new dimensions of horror and courage. But it also revealed the enduring power of truth. Martha Wilson had died seeking justice for forgotten children. Elizabeth Wheeler had scratched her name into a dark floor, determined to be remembered. Howard Jenkins had broken 50 years of silence as his final act. And because of their courage, because their voices had eventually been heard, real change had come. Outside St. Cecilia's, autumn leaves swirled in the October breeze. Kit looked up at the bell tower where Martha's evidence had waited patiently for decades. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked, joining her. "About shoes," Kit said. "If they hadn't fallen that day, if Jake's crew had demolished the building differently, would all of this have remained buried?" "I like to think the truth finds its way out eventually," Margaret replied. "That those who are lost will someday be found." As they walked away from the church, Kit thought she heard the distant sound of children playing, real children, in a nearby schoolyard, their voices carried on the wind. Free, safe, protected by reforms born from a tragedy long past. The tiny shoes that had rained down from a broken ceiling had set in motion a reckoning that continued to this day. They had started as evidence of cruelty and neglect, objects of confinement and control, but they had become something else, symbols of remembrance, of justice, delayed but not denied, of society's promise to do better by its most vulnerable members. For the children of Blackwood, silenced for so long, that was perhaps the most fitting memorial of all.